Thank you. Thank you all very much. I wanted to start by saying what an honor it is to be here. Erikson is doing such immensely important work. I've learned more and more about it over these last few days in particular, and I'm full of admiration for what's being undertaken. And I also wanted to congratulate Michelle Collins again. She's a remarkable person and richly deserving of this honor. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And as you know, for the time being at least, the Supreme Court has ensured the right to marriage for gay people across the country. And I set out to write my book. Far from the Tree. You've just seen the trailer for the film. The film was available for digital download from your cable provider. I set out to write the book and indeed to make the film, determined to understand how that had happened. How did the illness of homosexuality morph into the identity of gayness? And if that transformation was possible, if it was possible to go from illness to identity in that model, then where else would it be possible to make that change? When I was about 6 years old, I remember going with my mother and my brother to a shoe store in New York. I think the name wouldn't go down so well today. It was called Indian Walk Shoes. And at Indian Walk Shoes, my brother and I had our shoes fitted, and then the salesman said that each of us could have a balloon to take home. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, oh no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, will give you some feeling for a mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, my mother used to say all the time, the love for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. And when I was very little, I took that as a great compliment. It meant that bringing my brother and me up was the great joy of her life. And when I was an adolescent and she said it, it made me anxious because I thought, but I think I'm gay. And if I'm gay, I probably won't be able to have children. And after I came out, when she said it, it made me angry. And I told her over and over again, you know that's not who I am, you know that's not the path I'm on, and I want you to stop saying that. But she never did. The love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. In 1994, my editors at the New York Times Magazine asked me to write an article about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback for two reasons. First of all, because I had never known that deafness was a culture. I had always thought people were deaf, you know, those poor people, they can't hear, what could we do for them? But in the second place, because I had mostly been doing international reporting. My editor said, this is a foreign society in our own midst. And so I went into the deaf world. I went to deaf clubs, I went to deaf theater, I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where everyone complained about that slurry Southern signing. And as I immersed myself in that world, I saw that deafness really was a culture, that it was a culture united around the shared use of sign language. And it was a very beautiful culture, and in many ways a very seductive one. And I remember walking into a meeting at the National Association of the Deaf, and there were all of these conversations flying off the ends of hundreds of hands in a room about the size of this one. And I remember standing there at the edge and thinking, I wish I were deaf. which is not to say that I wished I couldn't hear, because my hearing is very useful to me and I use it all the time. But there was this society, and they were all part of it, and I wasn't. And I found it a beautiful society, and one that I would have been happy to be connected to in that moment. And then I found out that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those hearing parents have time out of mind tried to get them to function in what they perceive to be the mainstream world by focusing on lip reading and oral speech, and that many of those children have discovered deaf culture only in adolescence or thereafter, when it's come as a great liberation to them. And I thought how similar that was to the experience of gay kids, who are mostly born to straight parents, who mostly try to get them to function in what they see as the mainstream straight world, and who often discover gay culture in adolescence or thereafter, when it comes as a great liberation to them. And then I had a friend of a friend who had a daughter who was a dwarf. And she began asking questions that felt perilously familiar to me. Should I bring her up to think she's just like everyone else, only shorter? Or do I give her some sense of dwarf identity and join the little people of America? And as she narrated her bewilderment, I thought, here it is again. Here it is again, a child who seems to be abnormal in a family that perceives itself to be normal, and that has to make great accommodation for that child. And it was at that point that I began to hatch the idea of what I've called vertical and horizontal identity. Vertical identities are passed down generation to generation. So your ethnicity is generally a vertical condition. Your nationality, usually your language, often your religion. Those things parents have in common with their children. And some of those identities can be very difficult. The United States, as it's currently constructed, it is easier in many ways to be white than it is to be a person of color. But nobody has suggested that the solution to that should be genetic research to ensure that the next generation of children born to African American or Latinx parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. We recognize that the problem is in the society, and that it's the society we need to reform, not the individuals. And parents teach their children a sense of pride in those difficult identities. But then there are horizontal identities. Horizontal because you can't learn them from your parents because you don't have them in common with your parents. So being deaf, being autistic, being gay, being a prodigy, these are all things that you and your parents are unlikely to have in common. And it was those horizontal identities that I set out to research, and the process of acculturation that occurs when people who have those horizontal identities are brought into a society that recognizes them. So I think that all parents have two essential responsibilities to their children. You have to change your children, and you have to celebrate your children. You have to change them. Not changing your children is neglect. You have to give them an education. You have to try to give them a moral compass. You have to try to teach them some manners. You must change your children. But there also are qualities in your children, possibly qualities that you didn't anticipate or want, but that are essential to their character, which you have to accept and not to critique and criticize. So there's some things that clearly need to be changed, and there are some things that clearly need to be accepted. And there's a great deal that falls in a foggy middle. And it's that foggy middle where parents don't know, is this a thing to celebrate? Is this a thing to accept? Is this a thing to change? That's where the confusion lies. When I started working on this book, I was very much struck by the relationship between two ideas that I had previously thought of as separate, and those were the ideas of love and acceptance. We all know stories of terrible violence and abuse. They were alluded to in the film and presentations earlier. But in my experience, most parents love their children. They don't always love them wisely and productively, but they do love them. But acceptance is a process, and acceptance takes time. And it always takes time. It takes time even if your child isn't deaf or autistic or a dwarf. It takes a long time, really, to understand the humanity of your child for what it is. And that acceptance has to occur as a matter of self-acceptance, family acceptance, and society's acceptance. And they all feed one another. And parents tend, when they discover that their child has a major difference from them, to be outraged and overwhelmed. And they then tend to shift gradually toward being bewildered. And then after that, they get often to acceptance and even to celebration. So I'm going to tell you the stories of some of the people I interviewed, and I'll start with the story of Clinton Brown. Clint was born with diastrophic dwarfism. There are some forms of dwarfism that primarily affect one's height and not so much beyond that. But diastrophic dwarfism is a very, very disabling condition. And when he was born, the doctor said to his parents, he's not going to live for very long. He'll die relatively soon. It may be easier for you just to leave him here in the hospital where he can die quietly. Said, you don't even have to see him. And his mother thought about it for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, she said, that's my baby, and I want to see and take home my baby. And if he dies within a few months, at least I'll know that I gave him everything I could. So she took Clint home, and over the course of the next year, she went around to see doctor after doctor after doctor, and every doctor said, do you know what's going to happen? And do you know what, are you prepared for this? And are you prepared for that? And there's this dark thing that could transpire. And she described how over and over again, this sort of wave of negativity came out. And then despite having not very many resources, educational or financial, she found her way to the best doctor in the country for the treatment of skeletal dysplasias, dwarfing conditions. And she took Clint there, and she described how Dr. Kopetz at Johns Hopkins, she walked in, and he picked Clint up. Clint was a year old. He held him up to the light, and he said, let me tell you, that's going to be a handsome young man one day. And she talked about how everything was transformed then. And I always say when I address medical professionals that the way that you frame whatever the condition is of the child you're helping will have an enormous effect on how the parents experience the child's difference and how the child, him or herself, experiences that difference. It's terribly, terribly important. So in the course of his childhood, Clint had 30 major surgical procedures, some of them spinal surgeries that kept him immobilized for up to a month at a time with his head in a brace. And he decided while he was having all of these surgeries that since there was nothing else very much to do, he might as well focus on his schoolwork. And so he had a tutor who came to him and he focused on his schoolwork and he did well with it. In fact, he did really well with it. He did so well with it that he became the first member of his family to go to college. And he went to Hofstra, which was not very far away from where his parents lived, and he joined a fraternity, and he lived in a dorm, and he had a specially fitted car that he could drive, given that he was less than 3 feet tall, had various adaptive mechanisms. And I got a call from his mother one day. She called on the phone and she said, I was going home from shopping, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside a bar. She said, I thought to myself, he's 3 feet tall, they're 6 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. I wanted to go in there and interrupt, but I knew I couldn't do that. So I just drove home and left him 11 messages on his voicemail. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry was going to be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said to her, what did you do? What do you think you did that allowed this child for whom there was such a dire prognosis to emerge as someone who's popular and successful and well-adjusted and happy and ambitious? I said, how did you do it? And she said to me, what did we do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had this light in him, and we were fortunate enough to be the first to see it there. I'm going to quote you from one other magazine from the 1960s. This will be the last 1960s magazine quote of the talk. This was in the Atlantic Monthly in an article by a well-known American ethicist in a journal of liberal opinion in 1969. There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. We hear that now and can't imagine that being published in the mainstream media. In the years since it was published, there have been extraordinary reforms in treatments for people with Down syndrome who have achieved more and more. Some are able to function. They work as artists or writers or actors. There's even one Australian person with Down syndrome who's working as a runway model. Somebody who had worked for many years with people with Down syndrome described to me going out to lunch in LA with the actress who appeared on the television show Glee. And she said people were coming over and asking for her autograph. She was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. I never thought I would live to see that day. Tom and Karen Robards were hard-charging Wall Street types when their son was born with Down syndrome. They were young, and they were completely unprepared, and they were really shocked by it. And a few years later, when it was time for him to begin his education, they were very unsatisfied with the educational options that were available to them. And so they decided that they would get together with a few other families they had met who had children with Down syndrome, and they would ask for a teacher to come in and teach their children. And they went to the Archdiocese of New York and managed to get 2 unused public lavatories that they were allowed to convert into classrooms. And from those few children in those 2 lavatory classrooms has grown something called the Cook Center, which has been responsible for many of the advances that have occurred in the treatment of people with Down syndrome. And when I met with Tom and Karen, I said, "This has been your life." I said, "Do you regret it? Do you wish that your son David didn't have Down syndrome? Do you wish you could make it go away?" And Tom Robards, the father, said, "Well, for David, I wish I could make it go away. Because for David, it's a very difficult way to be in the world. But if all of the people with Down syndrome disappeared, I think it would be a real loss. I think these people have something to tell us." And Karen said, "I'm with Tom. If I could make it go away for David, I would for David because I'd like him to have an easier life. But speaking for myself, well, I would never have believed 20 years ago when he was diagnosed that I could come to such a point I have. Speaking for myself, I wouldn't exchange these experiences for anything in the world. They've made me so much better and deeper thinking and more thoughtful and persuasive a person than I would ever otherwise have been. And so for me, they've ended up feeling like a gift." Now, we live in a time of enormous medical progress and enormous social progress. The social progress I've just narrated. But cochlear implants mean that fewer and fewer people are functionally deaf. It's a device that gets inserted and allows sound information to bypass the mechanisms of the ear and go directly to the sound centers in the brain. There's a compound called BMN 111, which has been used in animals with the achondroplasia gene, achondroplasia being the most common form of dwarfism. Those given BMN 111 grow to full size. Treatment in human beings began a few years ago. And there are blood tests that allow people to pick up genetic anomalies like Down syndrome earlier and earlier, making it ever easier for those who want to terminate such pregnancies to do so. And I believe in social progress, and I believe in medical progress too, but I wish they were more awake to each other. Because sometimes when I see the triumphs that are taking place through social progress, I feel like the medical progress is coming in and undermining them all. And it's like one of those operas where the hero realizes he loves the heroine at the exact moment that she expires on a sofa. I was interested in looking as widely as possible at kinds of difference between parents and children. And one of the differences I looked at was criminality. Most children who commit crimes don't come from families in which crime is a commonplace. And in the course of that research, I went off and interviewed the family of Dylan Klebold, one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre, which, as most of you know, was the event that really started the wave of school shootings that continues to afflict us and set the model for much of the mayhem that ensued in our society. And I had thought that if I spent time with the Klebolds, I would see what was wrong in their household that caused this to happen. And the more time I spent with them, the more bewildered I was. They hadn't wanted to talk, and it had taken me years to persuade them to do so. But the first weekend I was at their house, they were so full of their story that they couldn't stop telling it. And I recorded 20 hours of interviews on tape. And on Sunday night, we were all sitting around in the kitchen, and Sue was fixing dinner, And I said, if Dylan were here now, is there something you'd want to ask him or something you'd want to know? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to know what the hell he was thinking. And his mother looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute. And then she said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And a few years later, at one of many dinners that we had together in Denver, I reminded her of that original conversation. And she said to me, you know, when it first happened, I used to wish I had never married, had never had children. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State, I wouldn't have crossed paths with Tom. These children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that I love the children I have so much that I wouldn't want to imagine a life without them, even at the price of this pain. When I say that, I'm talking about my own pain, of course, not the pain of other people. But life is full of suffering, and this is mine. So while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've decided that it would not have been better for me. And I thought, surely there's a fiction here. All of these parents who say that they love these damaged children they have so much, and that these children are so transformative for them, surely there's a level at which all of this is kind of a fiction. But I realized as I continued this work that all of us who have children who are flawed in one way or another. And if some glorious angel were to drop through the ceiling of the Radisson Ballroom and offer everyone in this room the opportunity to exchange the children they have for other better children who are more attractive and more intelligent and more polite, that everyone would pray away that atrocious spectacle. There's a theory that we not only take care of our children because we love them, but also love them because we take care of them. And the children I'm describing to you have in many instances required more care than is the norm, and that greater care has been the source of an enormous love. I talked to a number of mothers who had very articulate points of view on this. One who had 2 children with multiple very severe disabilities, couldn't walk and who couldn't talk and who were blind and so on, Sarah Hatton. And the children lived at home for as long as it was possible for them to do so. And after Sarah herniated a disc trying to lift one of them out of the bathtub, her parents found a way to put them in a group home that was not very far from where they lived, where they visited every day. And one day, one of the workers in the group home was giving one of the children a bath, and she left the room to go get a towel. And the Velcro in the harness he was in gave, and he slid under the water and he drowned. And when I talked to his mother, when I heard his mother at the internment of his ashes, she said, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." Another mother who also had 2 children with multiple very severe disabilities, who had relatively short lifespans, said, "People always give us these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen." And that's what I came to understand, that it was a choice. It was a choice to experience difference as a gift. It was a choice to go forward with difference as a gift. And there was a study done in which a group of women, it's always the women who are in these studies, but a group of women were interviewed shortly after giving birth to children with a variety of disabilities. And they were asked, do you expect to find meaning in this experience? And then they went back 5 years later, and they found that the children of parents who had anticipated finding meaning were doing better on every possible clinical measure than the children of parents who expected to do badly. So the expectation, the finding of the ways in which what you have is a gift, the celebration of the child you have is not only something that might make you feel better as a parent, it will also determine much of how well your child does. And it is a choice, it's a very difficult choice, but it is a choice that gets made over and over and over again. And it's part of how the experience of difference comes to unite us, because all of us have children who are different. I've never met anyone who hasn't occasionally looked at his or her child and wondered what planet they descended from. And that difference, that negotiation of loving a child who isn't what you imagined when you imagined having a child, becomes very central. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own family, which I had while I was working on this book. Everyone said to me, how can you be deciding to have children in the middle of a book about everything that can go wrong? And I had to say over and over again, but it's not a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much joy there can be in the experience, even when everything seems to be going wrong. And rather than frighten me away from parenthood, it's propelled me toward it. So let me describe my family in the most condensed way I can. My husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. My best friend from college had gotten divorced but wanted to be a mother, and so she and I decided to have a child, and we have a daughter who lives with her mother in Texas but visits often, and I'm down there a lot. And then John and I wanted to have the experience of bringing up a child full time, and so we have George, of whom I'm the biological father. John is the adoptive father. We had an egg donor, and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of his 2 biological children. Thank you. So the shorthand is 6 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And there are people who seem to think that the existence of families such as mine threatens the existence of families such as theirs. And I don't accept those subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I believe in the same way that we need a variety of species on the earth to sustain it through environmental crisis, we also need this variety of love to sustain the ecosphere of kindness. Now, the day George was born was, of course, very highly celebratory. But the next day, the pediatrician came into the room and said that she was concerned. And I said, oh. And she said, he's not extending his legs correctly. And I said, oh. And she said, that could be a sign of neurological damage. And I said, what? And she said, and insofar as he is extending them, he's doing so very asymmetrically, which could indicate a mass in his brain. And by the way, he has a very large head and should be tested for hydrocephalus. And I felt my whole being draining out onto the floor of that hospital as she spoke. And I said, but, and she said, we need to do some testing. And so my husband John and I went around that day with this child less than a day old and wedged him into the MRI machine, into another kind of X-ray machine, into a CAT scanner, feeling how little comfort we could be to him, this child we had just met. And I realized that I didn't want my child to have these disabilities, despite having written a whole book about how much meaning people could find in disability. And I realized that I didn't want to be one of those people, but I also realized that that was because I was thinking of illness. And like all parents, I wanted to protect my child from illness. But I knew in the back of my mind that if he had one of these conditions, it would also be his identity. And that if it was his identity, it was going to become my identity too. And I suddenly heard a voice in the back of my mind that said, the love for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. At the end of 4 hours of this, we were called in by the pediatrician who had all of the scans up on light boxes and who told us triumphantly that all of the tests had come out normal and that George was now extending his legs exactly as he should. And when I asked her what she thought had been going on in the morning, she said he had probably had a cramp. Children ensnared me in that moment when I associated fatherhood with loss. But if I hadn't been embarked on this research, I don't think I would have noticed it. At some level, as I was working on this book, I thought these parents were noble fools, enslaving themselves to a lifetime's journey with their thankless children and trying to breed identity out of misery. And that day, in the hospital with George, I realized my research had built me a plank, and I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you.